Hey everybody, my name is Ian, and today we're talking about Jacqueline Laznow's Gendered Foods and Traditions Among Argentine Jewry. I really like this article. I think that it's very new, and one of the things that it sort of emphasizes is when we speak about what we might call religious folklore, what the folklorist is interested in is how the thing that is one of the not we go back to our definitions of a folk group as two or more people who share one thing in common. And it might be strange to talk about that on the level of an identity as broad and with such a time depth as Jewishness. And it is. It's a multiform, multi-complex, multi-symbolic identity that has multiple interpretations to it. So, like all people who understand themselves as also participating in a community that is defined by faith, i.e., the interaction and intervention and of perhaps what we might call supernatural creatures, and a way of being in the world that is informed by that intervention and the precedent and the expectations who are set by that. We can speak about sort of identity as, from that sort of top-down perspective, from what the faith traditions suggest is the preferable way of being in the world. So we can look at things like attendance attendance at holy rituals. We can following food prescriptions, understandings of the family, and so on. All the things that we might think of in terms of our religious prescriptions and proscriptions for those that have them. So there's that. So Jewishness is a religious identity too, but it's also a kind of it just coincides so much with an ethnic identity, because one of the things that it does historically, at the very least, is that considering that it has for most of its history been understood as a minority community in whatever context it finds itself in, with the exception of the contemporary state of Israel, it is understood as being knowing itself as different from the larger, perhaps more powerful, perhaps more privileged, and perhaps more numerous community outside of it. So it has that notion of ethnic in terms of like an ethnos, in terms of being understood as other somehow. And it's, you wouldn't necessarily call it ethnic in terms of what we typically understand of ethnic, like often sort of physiognomy and genetic characteristics, although of course this is something that is often passed down through ascendancy and so on. But it is that sort of sense of at least bounded in some particular ways, and in esoteric and exoteric discussions with the non-member of that community. And as such, it's also like a socio-cultural identity, because again, in that folk groups who share two or more people who share at least one thing in common, it also has the possibility of a certain amount of syncretism, because it's not simply Jewishness, it is the Jews in Eastern Europe, and how being a Jew in that context developed certain forms of food habits and patterns and dress styles and expectations that borrowed from the surrounding community and were influenced by the surrounding community, in as much as it still nevertheless allowed for the proper exercise of Jewishness in terms of following religious prescriptions and so on, and let alone what was available to them within contexts of anti-Semitic laws and anti-Semitic history. Similarly in Western Europe and Spain, similarly in North Africa, and so on. And then finally, we can sort of think of it in terms of an immigrant community, where we sort of draw an arbitrary line in the sand, perhaps somewhere in like the 1850s, what we might sort of consider, it'll be pushing that definition of a long 20th century. But over the course of the long 20th century, where migration was as informed by such things as actual sort of recruitment and the general shift of people in the colonial settler exercise of filling in the North and South America with typically European communities. And so, and within the context of already towards the establishment of representational democracies, as much as that happens, and within the establishment of contemporary capitalism, or at least it's the vestiges of the industrial state. And so how it's the Eastern European Jews coming into North America or South America, and within that context of immigrancy, as opposed to sort of the perhaps, and again, maybe this is a foolish distinction, but perhaps the general shift of migrancy that happened prior to the mass industrialization of migrancy. And then you also have this idea, largely informed by perhaps these last three sections, this ethnic, the sociocultural, and the immigrant identity, where we can speak legitimately of sort of secular Jewishness, where they understand themselves as coming from with a particular heritage, a heritage that they might celebrate, a heritage that makes them unique, a heritage that, let's remember, can be joyful as well, and that the things that that are practiced within Judaism are things that they like to practice because it has good memories and it has personal connections with family and so on, which is going to be very important in Laznow's throughout Laznow's article. Despite the fact that they might not actually sort of, as they say, believe in the overarching narrative of their faith, and that they might not necessarily be what one might call practicing or adherent to the tenets of Judaism per se, yet they are culturally, not by default, but by choice, culturally maintain a sense of Jewishness in their day-to-day activities and how they choose to celebrate. They don't necessarily follow the rules of kosher all the time, but there are occasions when they do, and they follow foods that are informed by that, not because they are particularly existentially concerned with keeping themselves holy in the way that a religious prescription might be asking for, but just because it is fun and it is a participation in a community. So it's a form of identity work where this value and pleasure is worked through. And of course, this is perhaps doubly so the instance when we're talking about Judaism and the long history of anti-Semitism, where the identity of Jewishness might be thrust upon you because of circumstances, and which is really, really soft selling the concept of anti-Semitism, but and therefore, you know, the one is almost stuck with that identity, and then one participates in it in a form of defiance and solidarity and all the sort of multiform reasons, without necessarily it being a reason of that is about capital R religious faith. So Laznow is talking specifically about Argentina, which, just like the rest of North America and the rest of South America, experience those same kind of patterns of immigration. They might be perhaps like a decade or two different from North American immigration patterns, but more or less following the same thing. Mid-19th century, again, like what we can call the beginning of the long 20th century, people from Europe, including Jews, were encouraged to move to / flee from, but move to North and South America, move to the New World, and begin this process of ramping up the settler settler colonialism, but within the context of capitalism. And so they arrived in Argentina, and they found themselves within a very patriarchal labor system, and where women had very few opportunities for practice, and, you know, again, certain aspects of anti-Semitic things that would keep some Jewish men out of certain professions as well. There was a particular historical scandal where there were some Polish Jewish immigrants who had brought in young women, and there was sort of a prostitution ring. And despite, of course, it being clearly an exception and a minority of these new immigrants, the community nevertheless felt tarred with this. Sort of a grand stigma was associated for a number of years. And so within the Argentinian context, there was this desire to enhance this level of respectability, enhance this level of good citizenship, and basically refute the one or two bad people that had brought so much disrepute to the community itself. So the presentation of good Jewishness. So still maintaining a certain identity, perhaps at this point still very much because of religious faith. Maybe secularism hadn't come in at this time, yet nevertheless not choosing, not wishing to ostracize themselves and maintain this sense of otherness. And so, or at least overemphasize this sense of otherness. We are a distinct community within a community of Argentinians. We're not a distinct community that does not, cannot, will not assimilate, as it were. And that pressure back and forth between assimilation. And so you can ask yourself, sort of take a step back, and why Laznow is using food as much as she does to talk about it. And food has this sort of really interesting way of being one of those things that how culture is maintained and how cultural practices are maintained. In large part, and because it is a sensory experience, it is something that we don't need to go too far down the Marcel Proust's Madeleine road to think about how food can, the taste of something can remind us of previous episodes, of times past. And then, on that sort of pure, almost precognitional sensory level, where we're like, what is that? It is familiar. What is the nature of that familiarity? And then thinking backwards. Layered on top of that is more concrete memories, occasioned by taste, but more concrete memories of previous instances of food events, where the food event is prepared by a particular person, often within a particular context, and done with a particular amount of reestablishing community. I mean, what exactly, apart from the purposes of nutrition, clearly, because human beings have to eat, what we eat and why we eat and how we eat is largely this matter of culture, and is often a demonstration of, for lack of a better word, a demonstration of love, a demonstration of at least some kind of connection between the maker and the receiver, the cook and the consumer. This is we might sort of think it more abstract when we're talking about commercial foodways, but certainly within the home, one of the things that resonates are the foods that were prepared within a loving family, or at least on loving occasions where that is somehow special. So it's always, food always has that aspect of, it is a display event, it is a demonstration, because food is a finite resource. By me feeding you, I am maintaining the connection that I have through providing not simply the nutritive qualities, but the consequence of my labor, and the consequence of my labor that is directed towards often meeting your appetites and your expectations of food, of the thing. And by doing so, we are reaffirming our communality with each other. And what's more, those foods are prepared in particular contexts. And so it's not simply the act of making by the individual, but often the understanding that in this particular time, in this particular place, similar foods are being made in a similar fashion for similar groups. And so we can think about regional food habits that remind us of a place that is maybe even transcendent. We can also talk about things like, we can talk about commercial establishments where we have regional food traditions that we miss when we move away. Think about all the things about how, in terms of Cape Breton Pizza and the Cape Breton Pizza Parlor, about how people who are from here, if they move away, are lamenting the fact that they can't get their Cape Breton pizza. And it's not unique to here. It's a different food in different places, but even commercial establishments and the commercial expectation of taste. So there's a sense of continuity that is not about language. It's not about, it is transferable, because ingredients can be proffered and ingredients can be imported if you have moved away. Food is often located in place, but in the broad 20th and 21st centuries, we now have the ability to import because we live in a global economy. So these foods can be replicated, and home can be recreated at least through the consumption of these food products, and by doing so, aspects of a continuity despite spatial difference is present. And what's more, when we're not talking about the very recent immigrant or the very temporary immigrant, things like an international student who is here for a couple of years and might go home again afterwards, but in the interim wishes to maintain as much as they are interested in exploring their new context. They also, for enviable reasons, desirable reasons, wish to maintain a certain connection with the old, they can maintain their food traditions there. But if we talk about the longer stretch, if we talk about not simply a couple of years, but generations or so, food becomes a way of being able to pass down this sense of belonging to something, especially if we understand that the food is special and different from what might be had around the corner, or might be had elsewhere. Food that is as a special connection long after things like language disappear. If immigrant communities, often for reasons of the desire to assimilate and the desire to climb up into the cultural ladders of a dominant population, might actively discourage things like maintaining language. There's no point in maintaining Gaelic or Ukrainian or whatever. When you come to Canada, you should be learning English, and we sort of push that. One generation might push that away, often to the felt loss of a couple of generations hence. But it's food. That food tradition can be maintained, and food is something that you can feel that you are participating in an ancestry, an identity, even if other forms, particularly things like language, are not necessarily available to you. And the last thing to consider with this is how food has traditionally been understood as women's labor. At least food within the home has been understood as part of the ongoing form of labor that is justified as being indistinguishable from the emotional labor of maintaining the family and maintaining the household as an act of love, in addition to it being the practical act of doing so. So food is often gendered in this particular way until you get to the professional ranks, at which point patriarchy takes over, and clearly, like, the best food can only be made by male chefs. But the household food is not simply the women's prerogative, but it is almost emasculating to participate in food traditions. Although there's an interesting thing when we get to the Argentine, when we get to barbecue. And then food as women's work, as women's love work, as caring labor, all those sort of sense of terms, that becomes tied up with women's role as maintainers of tradition. Again, if we don't have to support the way that culture has often cleaved it this way, but it would be difficult to deny that culture has often cleaved the responsibilities this way. That men's labor is about the generation, certainly, again, starting in the mid-19th century, men's labor is largely about the generation of income for the household. That is how their labor is valued. Women's labor is much more complex and is focused on the ongoing maintenance of the home. It is unwaged, and therefore it is disparaged. Nevertheless, it is vital and critical, and it is also not simply about it is also about maintaining the community of the home, and one of the ways that the home is maintained is by women often being responsible for piety, often being responsible for the maintenance of tradition, the maintenance for religious traditions when it comes to that. And then we get back to this idea of sort of the good Jewishness that was sort of sought for after the scandal that happened. Getting back to the article, because that was a little bit of a segue, and she takes some time to introduce foodways as a concept to her readers, and I think it would have benefited from This is an incredibly well-researched article, but she seems to have limited her bibliography to the study of Jewish folklore. She could have extended herself a little bit further. She talks about Mary Douglas every now and then, but for the most part, she some of her arguments could have been at least summed up by adverting to this. But she's not citing many people outside of Jewish folklore. She's not citing many people outside. She's not citing many foodways scholars, and I think it would have been richer for it. But in terms of basically demonstrating that, yeah, she's right, because she's right on the money in terms of what the general scholarship says about food and the transmission of culture that way, and especially when we have this notion that, again, one of the things that we do when we gather together is we often demonstrate abundance. We seek abundance, and it isn't necessarily this crass display of wealth. It's not this crass display of the ability to do it that might be percolating underneath, but rather it is this display of sharing, of that no one will leave here unsated, no one will leave here without the ability to feel and participate in the love that food signifies. And so, and undergirding ethos of much in terms of domestic food habits, particularly at special events, is demonstrating abundance, particularly within contexts where scarcity is a genuine thing. It's one of the ways that we establish. Status always sounds cold, but it's one of the ways that we establish ourselves as being within an important relationship is the ability to provide and share and welcome. And she makes this point, which I've heard elsewhere, but I really like the way she makes it and the connection between food and language. Because as I just said, one of the ways that we participate in a culture is through food, largely when, for practical reasons, language gets lost. But food isn't developing the skill set for replicating traditional foods is complicated, but it is an awful lot easier than developing fluency within a language. Nevertheless, what often happens is that despite the fact that language might, as a day-to-day occurrence, might disappear, and fluency, traces of language might still be in place. Certain words that are present, for the older generation might use to express an idea, that might still be percolating. And again, these sort of cultural aspects, how one maintains, even accidentally, how one maintains a certain amount of socio-cultural identity with one's religious or ethnic forebears is through an alternative vocabulary, which is again not about competent fluency from head to toe, but being able to be conversant with particular terms, Yiddish terms, a certain amount of Gaelic terms, sometimes things that might be in, like if you were to hear people use them in English, or sometimes people sort of maintain idiosyncratic, anachronistic English words, and that's a kind of maintenance of some kind of tradition within a larger pan-North Americanness, despite the fact that a larger pan-North Americanness has English as its dominant language. These archaicisms become little sort of signals of that kind of connection as well. And the idea that the caretakers of the family's food traditions are the same people who maintain language traditions is also in place, because it's part of that collective responsibility of identity work. And that often literally falls on the grandmother or the matriarch in some capacities. And then, as we have again, I don't want to be glib with words. I don't want to use words like modernization, because that sort of suggests something like as opposed to archaicism or old-fashioned. But as communities change over the course of however the larger community adapts, and there are changes in gender expectations, what really happens more than anything else is there's changes in the economies of place and the economies of the home that require a skill set for women that is often over and above the still incumbent expectations of domesticity. And you have, perhaps a second generation where it's more concerned with that skill set outside of the home than within the home. Then the sort of representative, the symbolic representative of generations past, becomes a symbolic representative of the tradition, of the maintainer of tradition. And we experience that all the time. We being, more Anglo immigrants to North America experience that all the time. The idea that if you look in sort of grocery stores and how, or cookbooks, and how often the idea of grandmother's recipe is used, or how much the idea of some kind of older matriarch, mother, aunt, and so on, that they are a connection to the past, and they are still ongoing with their provision of goods. And no, this is the same in Argentina, and particularly among Argentine Jewry, where you have the notion of the bobe, the grandmother, who becomes this archetypal figure. Maybe literally within a family becomes the figure who is understood as responsible for this. And again, we probably have this notion of its grandmother's recipe that we are following on particular occasions. But then it's also metaphorical and starts to emerge as a symbol, starts to emerge as like how we start naming cookbooks, for example. It becomes transposed into popular culture. In certain sort of food events and certain food festival events, it becomes something where they become the symbol. And at cultural fairs, if you were to go to, just imagine yourself, if you were to go to a cultural fair and you were trying to look for the authentic food traditions, there's almost something, you might hate yourself for this, but I imagine this is actually the case. There's almost something where you would be seeking out the table with like the oldest woman there. It's like that is where authenticity lies. I'm using the word authenticity with all the scare quotes around, but it's still something that, even though we might not be able to name it, and we can have an authenticity discussion another time, it still might be something that we choose to pursue. We want the real stuff, and the real stuff is prepared by the grandmothers, and that's what we're seeking out. So even though these practices might be something that I don't wish to inculcate, I don't necessarily wish to do this within, devote the time, devote the energy, I am glad within my cultural milieu that there are people who do, and that becomes this literal or symbolic grandmother who is keeping at this all the time. And I love her idea of recipes as tactical tools of communication. The idea that there's this relationship between the food, the substance itself, the steps, the activity that is involved in preparing it, and then the person who is most associated with that particular recipe. They become scripts. They become scripts with a particular author, as it were, that you then pass down. The recipe as this kind of thing that exists not independent of culture, but can be somehow transplanted from one person to another. Think about your recipe books at home. Think about the recipe books that, again, and I know how gendered this sounds, but only because that's the culture that we live in. Things that are like your grandmother's recipe books or your grandmother's file cabinet or file box, full of index cards and things like that, where you might take them and all of a sudden the recipe is not merely a set of instructions. It is this script, idea. Yeah, it is this script that fundamentally the making of it in all its steps, from the idea of it, the procuring of ingredients, the preparation, and the serving, becomes a ritual exercise, particularly the serving that is directed towards the eventual eater, an intended audience for this eventual eater. It becomes this ritual exercise. We go back to this classic idea of ritual as something that, just like our capital R religious rituals, are connections with the sacred narrative, where re-performances, ritualized re-performances, Stations of the Cross, the Hajj, where we embody the actions of people that went before us, whether that happened here or whether it happened far away in a land that is important to our sense of origination. We also are doing this with a recipe. We are also basically transported back to our grandmother's kitchen, and we are doing this again while preparing something that can be then ingested and experienced with senses. And that is what sort of the recipe is doing. A lot of these ideas are present in her article. I highly suggest everyone in the universe read Diane Tye's Baking as Biography, which talks about this, at least in terms of the recipe as tactical communication. This ritual thing, that's kind of off the dome right now, but you know, there's there, because she talks about how, you know, making her mother's baking transports her back to her mother's kitchen, despite the fact that her mother is long gone and she's 1,000 kilometers away. So there's something about that ritual aspect of it. And just, you know, so quotes from Laznow: by keeping an old culinary tradition, Cecilia mediates between her late mother, who emigrated from Poland to Argentina, and her son's family, blending past, present, and future, because change is there as well. It's not a rigid adherence to the past. Ritual is nothing if it is stale. Tradition is nothing if it is stale and stagnant, because it is simultaneously, as much as it is an invocation, it is a reinterpretation. And so it is that intent. It is that intent of meeting the expectations of the family. In Cecilia's idea, the expectations of the son or even the grandson, who lives in a context that isn't Poland, who lives in a context that is not simply not Poland, but many generations hence, and has been influenced by Argentine culture and has their own palate. And it's not that they are rejecting, it's that is what contextualizes how they are interpreting. Not to mention certain aspects of the adaptation because of what is available and what is not available in order to reproduce it. So it is a script that is followed and simultaneously adapted. It is adapted in the way that it is made fresh and whole and renewed, and that changes are creative and dynamic and responsive. Changes are not a devolution. Changes are part of the ongoing, because these recipes have always been ongoing and adaptive and so on. Because Argentina allowed new context. Argentina allowed a different context. If we say that some of these traditions were born within circumstances of want, whether it is because of penury, whether it is because of landscape, where not as fruitful a landscape as might be elsewhere, whether it is from oppression, all of which condition the histories of food, and among other issues as well. When we come to a place where certain aspects, where certain other things are what's the word I'm looking for? I don't want. I'll say abundant again. I just didn't want to confuse the abundance from earlier, although that is part of it. But when certain foodstuffs that might have been a special occasion or a rarity or not even possible in an originating context are now part of the standard fare, those are things that can be adapted, and so we can have this both and. And particularly in Argentina, we're talking about beef. Argentina is a cattle culture. It's one of its prime industries. It's one of its prime exports, and it is one of its primary foods. And what is more, like elsewhere, our beef and red meat in general, but beef and barbecue and food cooked outdoors has a sort of masculinist aspect to it. The correlation between barbecue as a sort of one of those legitimate spheres of masculine cooking, if we still nevertheless, for the most part, think of domestic food as a domestic food preparation as a feminine act. Again, because patriarchy. Barbecue is one of those spheres of activity that has been cleaved off from that, and for its, again, perhaps the symbolism of beef, but also the idea of fire and metal and all those those rah kind of things, and its association with the narrative of Western expansion and the West and cattlemen and cattle country and all those sorts of things, which resonated on the literal and the popular culture level in Argentina as well as it did in North American sort of cowboy culture. Cowboys are essentially an Argentinian creation if we think about it, at the least in terms of the correspondence with, like, what's the pampas? Do I have that term correct? I will look that up, and if I have it correct, I will not put something on the bottom of the screen. So that's present, and so okay, how do food habits change in that particular ways? New technologies, new abundance, capitalism, all of these things change, and so change the possibilities of cooking, and so the maintenance of these food traditions are as much about adaptation as they are about strict adherence. Then cookbooks. And this is an interesting, it's not an aside by any stretch of the imagination, but it's a good time to think of it as an aside. Because again, once we have this notion that the domestic economy requires women to be outside the home, simultaneously there is a crisis of tradition. And there's a crisis that these skill sets will be lost, and the cookbook tradition emerges. It might seem to have only emerged in Argentina in the mid-20th century, but the cookbook tradition emerges. Like, how do we maintain, if we not have the pure inertia of the inheritance from generation to generation, then we need to use the media of the book, A, as a repository of this knowledge, and then B, as a shaming mechanism to maintain this knowledge. It's like, this is how proper, don't forget, as you are out doing your other things, as you have your skill sets doing your participation in the cash economy and capitalism that, quite frankly, you have to do because this is the nature of the beast. Nevertheless, the expectations of how to maintain a household and the things that are incumbent upon you, don't worry, we've got these books. If you think about a cookbook in that, and it's cynical. It's a cynical perspective, but think about it as like, I don't know if we're wrong. I don't know if that's not probably. Yeah, I mean, obviously there's always been lists of recipes, but the cookbook as part of the popular culture oriented towards women who were worried about how to maintain a home and how to keep it going, that's a more modern aspect of it. So we have this world that starts to not simply wish to maintain a home, but also is interested in domestic science, how to do it economically, how to do it following the latest in food trends and food understandings in terms of what comprises a good or a healthy diet, and what and how to introduce new tastes, new cosmopolitan tastes, because this is as much about even within, in general, it's about sort of middle class aspiration and aspirationalism, but doubly so. Okay, how do you do this? How do you become sort of a contemporary Argentinian, but also but also maintain Jewish identity? These books arise to sort of keep this going, and they demonstrate certain aspects of shunning Eastern European, because even within the larger Jewish community, Eastern European was somehow a stigmatized identity, the one that was sort of most seemingly redolent with the sort of old-fashioned non-assimilationist aspect. That changes over the years where that becomes embraced, but there are these aspects that are in place. So, but one of the things that it did is it started to show how to make Argentinian food that nevertheless kept the rules of kosher, the kashrut. And so this was, again, this assimilationist context. We have the similar thing that happened in North America, where with the invention, brief aside, the invention of vegetable shortening allowed for Jewish women to bake like North Americans, to make North American foods, pie crusts and things like that, pastries, which heretofore would have required either lard, which is typically pork fat, or maybe butter, which is dairy. So dairy wouldn't allow you to do things like make a meat pie. But all of a sudden, with shortening, with Crisco particularly, the company that's really zoned in on a Jewish market, they were able to reproduce North American style baked goods, the pie, the quintessential American food, the pie, without damaging their sense of holiness in terms of following their religious prescriptions. But one of the things, so going back to the Argentinian food, one of the things they did is they introduced the idea of how to maintain the food tradition of the asado, sort of the great Argentinian recreational food. In short, it's like a big ass barbecue. And I'm sure that we could dissect that a little bit, but it's the grilling of meat. It often takes place outdoors. It's a long day affair. It's a big ass barbecue. Let's just leave it at that and have the Argentinians come after me for lack of subtlety afterwards. And then that becomes so much a part of Jewish food habits because they are in this process of the both and. Maintaining a sense of Jewish identity, having those things, having very markedly Jewish foods on markedly Jewish occasions, high holidays and so on. And there are times when I want this, and then there are times when I still want to maintain the food prescriptions. I still want to maintain my food practice in terms of kosher, but what I really want to do is just like kick back on the weekend and be like every other Argentinian. So how do I do that? Cookbooks allow for that. They're sort of assimilationist exercises. Then we have the establishment of the State of Israel and first the sort of the movement towards helping, and a lot of capacity in terms of making goods and shipping them, or sort of domestic sphere goods, making them and shipping them over to Israel, and like the first wave of immigrants in the very late 1940s and the early 1950s as sort of pioneers, and then the general sense starting in the late 60s and early 70s of people going over there and doing national service, young folk experiencing time over there, and then eventually later on the idea of maybe moving to Israel, moving to a Jewish state. And as they move to Jewish state, as they move there, all of a sudden, I use all of a sudden so much, but as they move there, the maintenance of a Jewish identity is not a struggle in the same way that it is when you are in a minority community. Whether that minority community feels very comfortable within a majority, or whether it isn't actively persecuted because of a context of severe or even state-sponsored anti-Semitism. But in Israel, when everyone is Jewish, it is not difficult. You don't have to explain your high holidays. You don't have to write notes to your kids' school about why they're not going to be there on particular times, because the entire state is organized around that calendar. It is not difficult to procure foods, kosher foods, because the entire infrastructure allows for that. At least the dominant infrastructure allows for and intends and presumes kosher meat, done that way. The products, you don't have to be scouring, looking for seals of proof of kosher. You don't need to be looking at ingredient lists and double checking to make sure it's okay. The whole world is like that. And what happens then is one's Jewish identity becomes a given. It's not something that is forgotten. It's not something that is insignificant by any stretch of the imagination. But it is not the marker of a nostalgic past. It is not the thing that's passed down. So what happens in Israel is how much those foods that are much more coded as Argentinian than they are coded as Jewish become the foods of memory, become the foods of a connection with the past. And so all of a sudden, you caught me doing it again. So slowly you have this transition where it is one's Argentinianness that marks one as special, and all these stories that she includes about how people were speaking to parents, how people were speaking to like an older generation, and asking if they could speak in Spanish because they love Argentinian culture so much. And so that becomes the marker of identity. That becomes the nostalgic past. That becomes the thing that children are interested in participating in their comfort foods. Now, still, of course, for Jewish high holidays, they're eating Jewish foods, but their recreational, their cultural foods are as much, and cultural foods on special occasions are as much Argentinian, including that asado, where there is on sort of Israel Independence Day, there is a which is sort of much more. It's much more about Jewish nationalism than it is about Judaism per se. But the Jewish national holiday is also a day where there is a grilling experience. That is the food case, and so I can now do this grilling that is Argentinian, and bring it in to mark this particularly special occasion of Israeli, and lo and behold, I am both and. This food, this asado serves dual purposes on this particular day, in that it reaffirms my place here and it reaffirms where I come from. So again, when we go back to religious folklore as a concept, what the folklorist is interested in exploring is not entirely, there are aspects of it, but not entirely the specific interpretations of the holy texts on sort of literal sense of story then being retold, but the day-to-day practices that are conditioned by that participation in a narrative, and all the ancillary effects being understood as understanding oneself as distinct within a larger context, having that distinction placed upon you whether you want it or not in different contexts, and how this ongoing identity is maintained through artistic practices, through the creative practices that are the benchmark of what comprises folklore. This article is about identity. This article is about a religious sense, and it becomes a really interesting entry point into trying to understand this concept of how piety is maintained. Because even though a lot of this has to do with secular Judaism, it doesn't all have to do with secular Judaism. It does have to do with people who are committed at least to the practice and often to the faith itself. But how that is maintained within the complex webs of day-to-day experience, and in a move that is as much through as all folklore is, this tension that is between what has come before, the tradition, as it were, and that desire to maintain, while simultaneously the ongoing changing circumstances of the now, the ever-changing now, and the desire to adapt, the conservatism and dynamism. And that tension is so very creative, because that tension is going to happen anyway. And that's what the study of religious folklore is kind of about. And so I just think Laznow has this wonderful approach to it. And I'm very happy when I found this. Again, it's a really recent, as of the time of this recording, it's a very recent article. And so, I hope you enjoyed it. As ever, my friends, my name is Ian. Today we've been talking about gendered foods and traditions among Argentine Jewry by Jacqueline Laznow. And I bid you peace. Bye-bye.